here is another short video, hopefully, regarding Chapter 16 on Mixed Methods Designs. Now, the author goes into a lot of detail about different kinds of mixed method designs and how to evaluate them. We're going to get rid of a few of those things and try to streamline this whole idea. The major goals that I have, slightly different from his, are identifying the major types. I think that's important. Describing the key characteristics, and he's going to identify some potential ethical issues. I want to address that, and I don't think that they're that unique to mixed methods, but then also a framework to evaluate mixed method studies, which again I've simplified a little bit because I think that it all comes down to a smaller number of criteria. So just in summary, mixed method research designs have quantitative and qualitative elements. They can be all in one single study, or they can be in a series of studies, but the key element has to be the integration of quantitative and qualitative. They need to be measured in a complementary fashion, and they need to add something to the whole process that one single form of data collection will not. And so when do you use this? Well, when together they give you a better understanding. Now, this is almost always the case, right? That qualitative information can give you a better understanding than just quantitative, and likewise, adding quantitative can give you a better understanding than just qualitative alone. When you want to build on the strengths of either qualitative or quantitative research, then you can supplement it. And in these cases, you have one that's prioritized over the other. And we'll talk about the exploratory and explanatory designs. Then finally, when one type of researcher is not enough to address the research problem or answer the research question at all. In other words, you necessarily need both. And that can fall into a variety of different models. I think the author goes through some useful notation, right? This idea of what the plus means, what the arrow means, what upper and lower case mean, and so on. And we're going to use those in visual diagrams, and you might come across those sometimes as well in literature that you're reading, although I don't think it happens that often in mixed methods designs. When you're trying to determine what a researcher is doing, the three main questions you ask are: what is the reason or the intent for combining the two forms of data? Is it to compare, to validate one with the other, or to gain a more complete understanding? 2, what is the sequence of collecting qualitative and quantitative data? Do they happen simultaneously, or does one come before the other? That'll tell you something else about the design. And then what priority or weight does the researcher give to the quantitative or qualitative data? Sometimes you have a heavily emphasized quantitative study that has some supplemental qualitative information. Sometimes you have a very heavily qualitative study that has some quantitative supplemental information. Or sometimes you have both, and they're equally represented and important. Now, when you're thinking about what are your options for different designs, you have the convergent, explanatory, and exploratory basic designs, and then you have the experimental, social justice, and multi-stage evaluation designs. Those are your advanced ones. When we think about how these things interact, again, I like the figure that is in the text, the idea that you have these basic designs really that talk or emphasize a lot about the sequencing, the priority, and so on. But then if you add a framework of how you want to see the world, then you start to get into these advanced designs. So the framework might be experimental, right? When we think about what we've all talked about in terms of what experiments are and what they do with control groups and measures and things like that. That's one way. You have the social justice framework where I'm trying to advocate or call attention to some injustice. And then there's also the program evaluation framework, where I'm trying to determine if something is being effective or not. And so when we think about the different designs, right, the Convergent Design, he has these graphics in the text, which are really nice. The intent, right, is to compare quantitative and qualitative results to see whether or not they converge and give you the same story. If they don't, well, then you have some errors in either the way you're measuring things or what people are saying, right? And rectifying those mismatches can be very enlightening to solve a problem or address an issue. The priority is equal to both qualitative and quantitative, so both in caps. You typically collect them simultaneously, and then you compare those results to figure out if they are giving you the same story or giving you a different story. The explanatory sequential design, right? Again, he has this graphic in the text. The intent here is to explain quantitative results with qualitative data. And so you are going to collect quantitative first and then follow it up with qualitative data so you can better explain the numbers that you got. The priority here is on the quantitative data. And so an example like this might be where you are having people rate the effectiveness of therapy. And they just fill out a survey where they're saying my therapist was comforting, treated me like a human, and so on, was effective, used good strategies, respected me as a person. And you put that on a 1 to 7 scale and you collect all this data. And you're really just trying to measure, what do clients think of their therapists at a particular location. Well, you might get these ratings, but then you also might want to figure out, well, if they gave high ratings, what was really great about them? If they gave low ratings, why were they giving low ratings? And usually this happens when the items themselves, the quantitative items, don't adequately cover the constructs you're trying to get at. And so you get qualitative information to try to figure out what exactly is going on. On the other hand, you could have an exploratory design, where here the intent is to first try to figure out what's going on, figure out what questions to ask, what to measure, how to measure it, who to involve, right? And so you're starting with qualitative data and then trying to turn it into a survey, right? A lot of times when you are developing surveys, you first need to figure out what in the world you should be asking. When we develop surveys with some of the people I work with in the military, we typically want to talk to commanders and get an idea of what exactly it is that they're trying to figure out. What are the questions? What are the issues? How should we approach them? And say they're trying to figure out, well, do people feel ready under these new, say, COVID restrictions? Well, what do we mean by readiness? What does that break down into? What skill set, what differences, and so on. And from that, you build a survey. In a school, you might do the same thing, right? Where you're wondering whether or not teachers, both mainstream and special ed teachers, are having enough resources, right? Do they feel like they are empowered by the administration and so on? And so in order to figure out how you can get information in a quick way by giving a survey of some sort, you would probably ask some administrators, a few special ed workers, a few mainstream teachers, what in the world they're thinking about these things. And then try to identify, well, what are the themes? Do all the coding and everything like that. Try to figure out what exactly is going on. In this case, then you're using quantitative data to build on or explain the initial qualitative findings. So a handful of teachers said that these are the important issues and this is how they felt. Well, then we asked a whole bunch more teachers and this is what they said. When we get into the advanced designs, the intent of the experimental design is to add qualitative data into an experiment either before it begins, during, or after it concludes. And in this case, it can happen at all different time points, really, right? I can interview people before, during, and after to supplement my quantitative information. The priority is really to the quantitative data in this case. And the qualitative data is supplemental. When we think about, again, how the sequencing lines up, depending on when you want to supplement it, it could happen continuously throughout. It could happen before, it could happen after, it could happen during, and any combination of those, right? When we get to a social justice design, the intent here is to conduct the study within a framework to address a social justice issue, whatever that may be. Racism, treatment of the poor, lack of resources for people suffering from PTSD, things like that. One thing that just came up this past week was kind of healthcare as a racial issue and so on, and trying to address that through legislation or through some kinds of other government programs or even private programs. You can use any basic design, so you can use Convergent, Explanatory, or Exploratory, but you need to think about what is your overall orienting lens, like feminism, as a transformative framework. In other words, when we talked about those different types of frameworks that kind of go from pragmatism, feminism, what else did we mention? Constructivism, logical positivism, and so on. How are you going to be viewing the world, basically? How are you going to be approaching things? So the ultimate goal, though, is that you are calling for a change that will address whatever social issue you are trying to address. In a multi-stage design, you can use, again, a variety of different basic designs in multiple stages in some program implementation. The keys here are that you need to clearly identify stages that help address a larger program objective, and you need to interrelate the different stages to address a common research objective. So in a multi-stage design, you may be doing different things at different points because of what data is available, what's occurring in the program, depending on the time of the year, the season, or whatever. And then you just have to make sure that whatever data sources you're using, you integrate them successfully and complementary to tell a larger story to answer this bigger research question. Now, all mixed methods designs collect and analyze quantitative data. They use rigorous methods for sampling, analysis, and support, right? Same things that we would do for any single quantitative or single qualitative study. They integrate the data through things like merging and convergent designs, where you are comparing similarity and dissimilarities, connecting in exploratory designs, such as from quantitative results to follow-up interviews. Building is an exploratory design, such as from qualitative exploration to developing an actual survey instrument. And embedding as in an experimental design, where I'm embedding some qualitative data within a quantitative procedure. They typically use the specific mixed methods design based on intent, resources, and effectiveness. So in other words, you're going to pick your design based on what would work. And the study needs to be framed, usually, not always, within some kind of theory or philosophy of social science, social justice, a particular worldview, or whatever. Because, and really this is, I think, true of every study, or at least it should be true of every study. And it's important to be aware that you're always using some kind of frame, or that any research article that you read always has a particular framework that it is operating from. So that's really true of all studies. When we talked about priority earlier, I just want to clarify this term just to make sure. It is what the researcher emphasizes, what data gets paid more attention to. There's more of it. They use it the most to answer the most questions. They rely on it the most as a source of evidence to draw conclusions, and they go the deepest into it to explore what it means in terms of face value and interrelations between different pieces of data. The sequence can go right in different orders. One, you can do things both at the same time. You can do quantitative first, qualitative first, or you can do a mix and match, especially in multi-stage designs. Finally, this brings us to the evaluation model. Now, the author has a couple extra things that I don't really think are necessary. I think that when you are evaluating the quality of a mixed method study, the main thing you need to do is focus on whether or not the quantitative side is good and whether or not the qualitative side is good. The only added thing is that you want to make sure that the integration of the quantitative and qualitative data is logically consistent and informationally complementary. I agree with that completely. And that you want to make sure that the information is not just redundant and more of the same, but it gives you another perspective or another side that you can't get with the other method alone. Now, Cresswell says that there are some additional things, right, that they need to specify a particular type of mixed method design. I really don't think this has anything to do with the quality of a study, right? I mean, so what if I say, oh, I'm using an exploratory design and then I poorly execute both my data collection procedures, right? Saying this doesn't really matter that much. So yeah, it's nice. It makes it clear to the reader, and it makes it seem like they know what they're doing a little bit more. But in and of itself, it's not that important. Citing mixed method literature to document the use of mixed methods. Again, I don't think this is necessary either. Just because you are incorporating two different forms of data doesn't mean that you have to cite other studies. In other words, if I am going into a field and I want to do a mixed method study and there have been some quantitative and some qualitative, I don't need to evaluate or mention any other mixed method studies if I'm not really using them to support why I'm doing my study. It only makes sense if it does. And so you can have really good mixed method studies that do not cite any mixed method study in the lit review. So I don't even think that's a feasible or a necessary criteria. So we're just going to stick with these two up here. Which brings me to your assignment. We are going to be doing one mixed methods evaluation study. I want you to focus on how good is the quantitative side of things, right? We're going to focus on a few different things, and it's up to you to try to recall and look through your notes to see what these things are. Same thing for the qualitative side of things, right? Fewer things really to worry about there. And then I want you to give some kind of evaluation on whether or not you think the integration was logically consistent and complementary, giving an example of why you are making the judgment that you are. Ultimately, I'd like you to indicate whether you think it's a low quality, moderate quality, or a high quality study. Please Dropbox this in Canvas, and then I will send these out at the end of, or actually the beginning of next week, next Monday. And that should take care of it.